Please give a warm welcome to Kevin Escom.
Thank you, Ollie, and to all of the organizers who put this together, and all of you for coming to deal with biorisk, which is unfortunately one of those nearer term catastrophic risks. And as we've all lived through the last couple of years, there's no real need to explain why it would be decidedly unfortunate if many people could unleash the next COVID. The reality is, we are probably going to live in that world within the next decade or so.
I'm making this video to give you a warning, to take the next pandemic deadly seriously. The exact same evidence that made me skeptical of the COOF pandemic from the very start has led me to think that the next time will be the real deal. The next pandemic response will not be as soft as this one. Masks are not enough. Not even a respirator mask with a filter. That won't do. There will be zero shared airspace. No classrooms full of students, no malls, no restaurants. Total sanitation. All shared airspace is to be purified by invisible UV light directed at the ceiling so that it doesn't blind you.
On the far right is an image from a startup that is looking at using far UVC light, which is still microbicidal, but it doesn't look like it harms our skin, and probably not even our eyes, meaning all of the lights in this room could plausibly be augmented by far UVC, and it would just sterilize all of the air around us all the time. What they also want to do is build broadcasters that you can wear and would sterilize the air around you as it comes towards you. If that could work well enough, we might not even need masks. That would be great. These are the kinds of things that we all need to investigate, but the bottom line is all air touching mucous membranes must be sterile.
But that's not enough. A restaurant that does want to operate can use air curtains so that customers have no shared airspace and it's all filtered through a purification system.
What are air curtains?
So air curtains is an idea where, suppose you want to have dinner with friends in a restaurant, but you would like to see them. You don't want to have to wear one of those suits with a face covering or anything like that. Can you sculpt the airflow in there so that you have essentially separate bubbles of air that you're breathing, so that the curtains of air actually ensure that nothing that you exhale gets to them, and vice versa? The air is invisible. Can we create barriers made of air to reduce infection? Any of you interested in semiconductor physics and the like, some far UVC LEDs would be great, or really any other way of generating that class of radiation. HEPA ventilation, air curtains, all these things could improve our safety within buildings and the like. Even things we already have UVC LEDs. You know, what if every of these walls had UVC LEDs pointing upwards so that most of the air in this room is just sterilized all the time? You can certainly add them to ventilation ducts. That's stuff that we have now. We just need to actually implement it.
How grocery stores would be retrofitted to fit these new pandemic protocols isn't explained, but as we saw last pandemic, restaurants will either comply or they'll be forced out of business. As I said, a mask simply will not do. An essential worker of the next pandemic must wear a hazmat suit, but not the type you see in the pandemic movies or roaming the streets of Wuhan. These will be sleek and stylish.
Biotech cannot reliably defend us from biotech, but other things can. Most obviously, if you are a human and you are worried about a biological threat, the best thing to do is to ensure that it does not come in contact with you. And this is an eminently achievable goal. You can go the minimalist route. $40 on Amazon today, you can have a powered air purifying respirator of the most basic form that just connects to a mask. You can strap it on your arm and go running with it and the like. I don't actually think that that would save you from COVID, let alone something like measles, but it's a step in the right direction that would mitigate everyone's risk if people were willing to wear them. In the middle is a more standard mask for a powered air purifying respirator. You can see the hose going down the back. It's not exactly what I would be happy to see everyone wearing all the time, shall we say, There are some style benefits that I think are perhaps lacking there. And at the end of the day, people have to be willing to wear this stuff, right? If there's going to be a new warning, people don't want to go back into the COVID days. That's why it's delightful to all be here together as people in a room without worrying about it. This time period is probably not going to last. But if we have to wear anything like this, then let's make it as comfortable and stylish, lightweight, durable, easy to use, the works as possible. This is doable. We've thrown hardly any money in this. Air purifying respirators were designed to give you clear air in case you're working with industrial hazards. They were not designed, for the most part, to keep you from getting infected with viruses. We can do better.
Although we cannot see the visuals in this presentation, I think the odds are that he was showing something like this of his colleague, George Church, which I first took to be a joke, but I think was actually a serious proposal by this man who snorts his own homemade vaccines and labels himself a genetically modified organism.
This problem has actually been solved. If you're willing to wear a suit like that, it's designed to make it easy to doff without getting contaminated. I'm sure we can do better than that, but that kind of suit is basically proof against virtually anything that bio can throw at you, at least while you wear it. And it's designed so that you can doff it without contaminating yourself. So we already have the basic tech. It's just, I don't think people are going to want to actually wear it. And that's the thing. The people we need to wear it are actually not most of us in this room. It's essential workers. It's the folk who ensure that we all have enough food, water, power, law enforcement, and possibly healthcare. You can, in an emergency, do without the healthcare, but the other four are absolutely essential. If those people have good enough protective equipment through any combination of mechanisms, then civilization is okay. At least until we run out of materials that are provided by supposed non-essential workers, in which case we need to have protection for them too. So we can't assume that the global supply chain will remain intact or be swiftly repaired if this sort of thing happens. That's another policy area that we need to work on. How do we ensure that we have resilient stockpiles of whatever is required in the event of the next pandemic?
This is, of course, Kevin Esvelt speaking, the man who invented Bill Gates' depopulation technology, the gene drive at Jeffrey Epstein's lab, the program for evolutionary dynamics. Esvelt is here speaking at a conference held by the Center for Effective Altruism in 2022. The video is called Preparing for a World in Which Thousands Can Unleash New Pandemics.
The problem is there are entirely too many people like me, and specifically like me and any of the rest of you in the audience who have been trained in molecular biology. There are now protocols online for assembling, say, a coronavirus or an influenza virus just from using standard laboratory materials. And there's a lot of us who can do this. If you just count folks with doctorates, you can calculate that there's probably 30,000 or so people who can make influenza viruses from scratch. And this is because scientists, of course, want to study these viruses, come up with better cures, and so forth, and that is why it is now a relatively straightforward matter to generate and test new virus configurations using what now amounts to the world's best Lego set. This probably does not sound like the greatest of ideas to anyone in this room, but if your goal is to cure disease, you need the tools to study the enemy. And that's not going to stop. It's already there. There's nothing we can do about it. Number two is just DNA, and especially gene synthesis for long genes is now extremely cheap. The first virus assembled from synthetic DNA was put together in 2002. In the last 20 years, the cost has dropped by 1,000-fold and is likely to continue to drop. So it costs less than $1,000 to make 1918 influenza virus today. But that doesn't mean we can do anything about it. If COVID has taught us anything, it's that, great, early warning would have been fine. That would have been fantastic. Maybe we could have slowed it down by, say, shutting down international air traffic. That would have bought us time. But it's hard to imagine that we could have actually contained and stamped it out, which is what we're going to need to do. And if we can't do that on a global level, which we might not be able to do, then that means that any nations that do manage to suppress it, because again, if there's an adversary releasing it, they're probably going to release it in multiple airports at once. So we're probably not going to be able to just stamp it out. But some nations may be able to get it under control, suppress it, and then they're going to have to keep it out. Which means that any nation that succeeds like that is in a predicament kind of like China is in today with the Omicron variants. And they're losing. So what can we do in terms of technology that will give nations that are less well suited to welding people in their apartments the tools to suppress pandemics? Omicron spread from a single point source in Africa. Within 100 days of it being identified and sequenced, it had infected more than a fifth of the US and at least 2/5 of Europe. Note that 100 days is the stretch goal of the White House pandemic preparedness plan and every other plan of every other nation I've ever seen for a vaccine becoming readily available.
The next pandemic, the response will be more extreme. And for it to be more extreme, the disease must be more severe. Millions, if not billions, would have to die to impose the next step of the agenda. The next step can loosely be categorized as total surveillance.
What if we could give everyone an individualized early warning telling them how many of your connections, your first-degree connections that you normally come in contact with, or your secondary connections, their contacts, or the ones beyond that or the ones out, what fraction of those have been infected already? If you could give everyone that information, then they would start taking precautions before they get infected. But this is probably the hardest part. We can invent the necessary tech. We may not be able to get government to help us, but we can probably persuade enough people, build enough companies that we can get everything out there. But what we can't do is make people use it. We can't persuade them that it will be necessary. If there's an 80% lethality pandemic, our job is probably done for us. But at that point, a lot of people will have died needlessly. So we have to find some way of persuading people to actually use it, and ideally do so in advance of the actual threat coming their way.
On the websites of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and of MasterCard, of course, the credit card company, we can see their mutual plans for a partnership with each other and Microsoft's Trust Stamp digital identification. This is essentially a vaccination record that's linked to your Global Citizen passport. Global Citizen, of course, being Bill Gates's movement that you see. You'll see it. It's got a red circle in the O of Global Citizen, and you'll see it at the UFC, Bellator, like MMA matches. You'll see it at all sorts of other sporting events, but you'll also see it marketed different ways in, say, events that women are more interested in. For example, they make up a lot of the hashtag campaigns that are on Facebook and Twitter. A lot of those are global citizen initiatives, not actually grassroots.
Are we going to ask you to support another campaign about empowering women and girls? Absolutely.
Because if everyone in the world thought of themselves as global citizens, it would help make sure that women and girls receive the education, opportunity, and respect they deserve.
Only global citizens can make global change.
And given MasterCard's partnership, we can imply a financial or credit, or hey, a social credit or other equity scheme tied into these passports. Here's your entry point 2 for a centralized digital currency, something that we're hearing from all sorts of corners of the internet as well. And while we're on that, we might as well throw out internet identification, which will probably have an anonymized front end, but not on the back end. That will be tied, as it largely already is, to your cell phone, to your devices, to, of course, your IP address, right? Your ISP provider. That's just going to be tightened and tied to one central identity, which in essence is your link to the Internet of Things. This trust stamp scheme was developed shortly before the pandemic and has likely expanded due to the absolute insane tyranny that governments and corporations got away with. For example, phones became people's passports to enter a restaurant. As technology proliferates and the news tightens and an actual physical passport is made practically obsolete by, say, a 5G powered Internet of Things capable of using hyperspectral imaging to read biometrics, see my video on that. It sounds crazy, but I show you the evidence. As the news tightens, actual presentations of such passports becomes participatory and compliance-based rather than necessary for any sort of a punitive system to function. The surveillance system of the future knows where you're going before you're allowed to go there, especially if you're leaving your 15-minute city containment bubble. We hear a lot about these systems in isolation, but now we can begin to see how and why they all come together in the next pandemic.
We need to never test an engineered human virus for its ability to evade all of the different forms of pre-existing immunity that our bodies develop. If we can avoid that, or at least delay it for as long as possible, because preventing it entirely is probably not in the cards, then we can buy ourselves additional years to prepare our defenses. There's lots of tremendously well-meaning scientists who want to prevent the next natural pandemic who are running these kinds of experiments. They earnestly believe that the best way to prevent the next natural pandemic is to identify every virus out there in nature that could cause it, and to share that knowledge with the world so that we can develop better molecular countermeasures, yes, but also ideally intervene in the wild to prevent spillover. There's lots of reasons why this is, probably not worth the proliferation cost of what they're doing, but they're not thinking about fighting humans. They're not used to human adversaries. Most of us in science, at least in the life sciences, think about nature as the adversary. It's nature that throws new pandemic viruses at us. And so the folks who are the source of the greatest risk is not foreign bioweapons programs who would never share their results and recipes with the world. It's actually well-meaning scientists who are trying to save lives. But none of that is going to be enough. We also need to restrict access to individuals who are ultimately the source of the risk. We need to assume that we're going to lose control on the information side. Right now, the best estimate for how many people are going to have access to these things is going to be somewhere in the tens of thousands of individual actors who just happen to have the laboratory skills to follow one of these 120-step Nature Protocols papers. There's also a bunch of well-resourced actors who are mostly nation states or well-funded teams who could also do it. But most of those lone wolves who can do it on their own rely on synthetic DNA. That is, they can't make the DNA encoding the virus on their own. They have to order it from a commercial supplier. If we could actually screen virtually all DNA synthesis in the world such that whenever someone tries to warn the world about a new threat, which is how most scientists think about this, then we can add it to the screening database, and then people won't be able to order the DNA for it. And that would reduce access by probably 100-fold. But it would be even better if we can get that in place. What if we could disseminate the idea that maybe we shouldn't share blueprints for plagues? That sharing that with the world is not actually the best thing, that information hazards are a problem, and the responsible thing to do is instead report one's concern so that the relevant agent, along with a suitable number of decoys, can be added to the hazards database. And then scientists would not be publicizing the risk while there's still no patch. No one would do this in cybersecurity, but people somehow think in bio that that is the appropriate thing to highlight the risk. That is something that we can change if there is something positive and obvious that they could do to help. And so DNA synthesis screening is one such thing. So we've been working on this with an international team of mostly cryptographers for some number of years now. And we have a system that we believe will work that can protect the identities of the synthesis orders themselves while still screening them against hazards without, again, disclosing the orders themselves, which of course are, you know, the roadmap to whatever a pharma or biotech is doing research-wise, or what we think the hazards are, if need be.
A World Health Organization initiative is implementing a program to spread mRNA vaccine production hubs all around the world to facilitate the rapid production of mRNA-based vaccines for, of course, the next pandemic.
And I have now the pleasure to announce Dr. Tedros from the WHO. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator, Your Excellency President Macron, Excellency President Macky Sall, Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Excellency President Kenyatta, Excellency President Buhari, Excellency President Said, Excellency President Michel, and Excellency President von der Leyen, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. Good morning, bonjour, and it's an honor to be here with you. Today, I'm delighted to announce the first 6 African countries that will receive technology from the hub to produce their own mRNA vaccines: Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tunisia. WHO will work with the companies and the government in each country to develop a roadmap for training and production based on their needs and capacities. We're very honored to be joined today by the presidents of all 6 countries, as well as President Macron, President Charles Michel, and President Ursula von der Leyen. The leadership and support of the European Union, the European Commission, and the European Council have all been essential in bringing us to this point. So I'd like to say thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Using guaranteed purchase systems to fund the program, this is a cartel by definition. These cartel-style arrangements, as they themselves state, vaccines can be bought cheaper from Europe and brought to Africa, and so forcing the African Union nations to buy from one another at higher rates is how they'll uphold and subsidize this industry. Sounds great when your people are living in poverty, right? You're the poorest country in the world, and it shows why.
The lack of a market for vaccines produced in Africa is something that should be concerning to all of us. Organizations such as COVAX and Gavi need to commit to buying vaccines from local manufacturers instead of going outside of those hubs that will have been set up to go and buy vaccines for distribution to the African continent again. They need to then buy and commit that they will buy from the locally produced hubs once they get going. This will enhance the spirit of Africa's determination to enhance biotech sovereignty. Unless Africa has a vaccine market, marketing vaccines will soon collapse.
Also, African countries that have vaccination programs, between ourselves, we can contract purchases from these new laboratories and these new factories to ensure that this African production is nurtured, because these vaccines will be produced elsewhere more cheaply, of course, and so it's important that above and beyond technology transfer, we also then purchase the vaccines.
So they're going to be legally obligated to buy these vaccines whether they're needed or not, even if they can't be administered for logistical reasons.
And we express our gratitude to the President of France, especially, for giving us a lot of the COVID vaccines, which we try very hard to make sure that we have the storage so that they don't get expired quickly, and effect of the heat of the weather there, we try to make those logistics available.
This Tedros-backed initiative will cost the poorest nations of the world tens of billions of dollars to have gene therapies pushed on them ceaselessly. Because if they are able to mass produce and distribute, they'll find all sorts of reasons to do this. Trudeau announced the construction of an mRNA vaccine plant in Canada in mid to late 2021, to my memory. Now, things were calming down by then. It was evident that this pandemic would be over. Vaccines were out by then. This vaccine factory, this Canadian vaccine factory, won't even be ready until 2024, and probably a year or two later, to my guessing, government contract and all. These things were never going to be for COVID. It was never about the COVID.
So the fight we are in today is a fight which will last above and beyond, or beyond COVID-19. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
So the delivery dates of these mRNA hubs, of these mRNA factories, these will be the yardsticks that we have for how much time we have left. When these things are ready, then comes the next pandemic. Klaus Schwab warns of an angry world of unrest. How would you force these programs onto this distrustful, post-COVID society, even given some mild to moderate catastrophe, something significantly worse than COVID itself?
Right now, there's at least interest in doing that because people recognize that emergency use authorization is not really designed for actual emergencies. So that is a policy hurdle that we're going to have to overcome, because a lot of the folks at these agencies have just not, like, their incentives have been shaped in normal times, shall we say. There's no one there who has been shaped under incentives of a true emergency under the pandemic. So we need to find those very few people who have any kind of credibility in these circles, who acted very quickly with COVID and understood that challenge trials were probably necessary and things like that, and try to usher them into the relevant policy positions and encourage politicians to recognize this as a problem and sort of specify.
How about an emergency dictatorship via a secret shadow government?
We need a sort of a backup team. You know, you declare an emergency, and now the acting chair of the FDA with respect to vaccines is not the current FDA commissioner. It is someone who is specifically approved in advance to be the person to take over in a pandemic emergency. And we might want to do this for many different relevant agencies. That's sort of a broader policy question that I would definitely defer to other folks, but our society is not good at adapting to radically different conditions. So one plausible way of dealing with this is to say, we need some way for people to declare an emergency and then have a completely different set of people take over whose job it is to prepare for that emergency at all times in case they're called upon.
Have there been cases of pathogens escaping from labs and causing harm?
There absolutely are instances of pathogens escaping from labs and causing harm. In fact, in the UK, a leaky pipe from the Pirbright Institute caused multiple outbreaks of animal class pandemics within weeks of each other. So yes, leaks are a thing. They will happen. For our purposes, probably the greatest concern is a leak from an actual weapons lab. Because natural pandemics are just not threatening enough on their own that an individual leak can cause anything worse than a natural spillover event. And we know that natural pandemics are very, very bad, but they are not on their own going to threaten the stability of civilization.
Yeah. So there's a question to Kevin. What's your most optimistic and pessimistic scenario for next year?
So in brief, we're already above my 5% lower bound for number of deaths, but we're several orders of magnitude below my 95% upper bound for likely deaths.
We know that natural pandemics are very, very bad, but they are not on their own going to threaten the stability of civilization.
95% upper bound for likely deaths.
And this dictatorship, it's gonna act before the threat is even known. And what this means is that your rights can be infringed, even if there's no apparent reason for it. And then, if nothing happens, they can be praised for preventing their own prophecy. However, I am here to warn you, they may be right.
This is the problem. Pandemic proliferation would be much, much, much worse than nuclear proliferation.
Once again, there is necessary primer knowledge in my video about Jeffrey Epstein's eugenics program, or the video Eugenics Are Here. I've been trying to raise awareness that you can, at least practically, end the world from your garden shed. The state of gene editing has allowed tens of thousands of people to access an invisible and silent weapon which is far more deadly than a nuclear bomb. I've talked endlessly by now about CRISPR gene drives and the danger they present, but there are other techniques that are so dangerous that you aren't even allowed to think of them. You aren't allowed to know that they exist, lest that knowledge spawn them into existence.
Delaying means denial, first of all, denying people information and access to the physical materials they need in order to make pandemic class agents. Reliable early warning means we need to monitor to ensure that we can detect any given biological threat that exhibits the characteristics of something that can cause tremendous harm. And for protection, we need to figure out ways of actually preventing the spread of human-targeted biological agents. Many of you may be involved in shaping national policy. It so happens that the US is probably the worst offender when it comes to identifying these kinds of viruses. There are other nations that do it as well. But in the US, a major problem is that we do see this as a problem for CDC and NIH. Pandemics are not seen as a defense issue. Even biosecurity, people tend to think of it as, well, that's a global health issue. This is not a global health issue. This is a defense issue. And if the Defense Department took it seriously, they actually have the budget to deal with it. So we might actually get some help there. We have to persuade folks in defense that this is their problem. We need to ensure that health agency research is actually overseen by security experts. Right now, NIH, for example, sets their own regulations, their own oversight. They work to regulate the research they fund with the institutions and researchers that they support. There is no external oversight except for a body that NIH appoints and has in the past completely fired and replaced when they didn't like what they said. That doesn't sound like very effective oversight, and this is something that we can point out. We can't even reliably beat nature when it comes to fending off nasty biological agents. If we can't reliably beat nature, why would we imagine that we could defeat an enemy who knows what we have in our pocket? If the adversary knows what therapies you have stockpiled, they can design around them. So we better, if we want to rely on therapies, we better keep some of them secret. That's not something that NIH policy even allows today. Your grant requires you to disclose all of your data. You cannot keep some of it back on grounds of, we need to show that we have a viable therapy and we have several alternatives that we're not telling you about. That's just explicitly not allowed. They don't think that way.
And not only will this information be restricted, it must be, the entire concept must be hidden from your mind, lest it turn into, you can't have a revolution if the idea isn't in your head. It's kind of the concept of newspeak, right?
Thank you. Someone asks, how should we, the audience, and I know you think about this yourself, balance the benefit of raising awareness of the problem with the risk of spreading attention to people we don't want to know about?
Yeah, so information hazards is really the key stickler in bio. And the real challenge with it is that you don't want to even articulate a particular concept that people aren't broadly aware of. Because most scientists really just don't think about this. There's no security mindset at all. And we're better off that way. I really don't want us going around telling scientists that bio could be horrifically misused in this way, because then they might decide to think about how it could be done. And that could lead to earlier disclosure, and we might end up accelerating the day when nasty things become available. So you'll note I haven't talked about engineered really anything other than the engineering tools necessary to stitch the thing together. We don't need to make the case by referencing any fancy human-engineered pandemic-class agent. You can just say, you know what? If people post this list of pandemic-capable viruses rank-ordered by threat level, then people could release 10 different pandemics simultaneously across many different airports. That could plausibly threaten civilization right there. There's no need to invoke making things worse with biotech. And that means we don't have to. There's just no need to investigate how things could be made worse in order to persuade people of the magnitude of the threat. That is one thing that COVID, I think, has given us.
But not only that, but false information will be put out. Decoy plagues.
But none of that is going to be enough. We also need to restrict access to individuals who are ultimately the source of the risk. We need to assume that we're going to lose control on the information side. Right now, the best estimate for how many people are going to have access to these things is going to be somewhere in the tens of thousands of individual actors who just happen to have the laboratory skills to follow one of these 120-step Nature Protocols papers. There's also a bunch of well-resourced actors who are mostly nation states or well-funded teams who could also do it. But most of those lone wolves who can do it on their own rely on synthetic DNA. That is, they can't make the DNA encoding the virus on their own. They have to order it from a commercial supplier. If we could actually screen virtually all DNA synthesis in the world, such that whenever someone tries to warn the world about a new threat, which is how most scientists think about this, then we can add it to the screening database, and then people won't be able to order the DNA for it. And that would reduce access by probably 100-fold. But it would be even better if we can get that in place. What if we could disseminate the idea that maybe we shouldn't share blueprints for plagues? That sharing that with the world is not actually the best thing, that information hazards are a problem, and the responsible thing to do is instead report one's concern so that the relevant agent, along with a suitable number of decoys, can be added to the hazards database. And then scientists would not be publicizing the risk while there's still no patch. No one would do this in cybersecurity, but people somehow think in bio that that is the appropriate thing to highlight the risk. That is something that we can change if there is something positive and obvious that they could do to help. And so DNA synthesis screening is one such thing. But at the end of the day, that's going to fail too, right? Even if we get DNA synthesis screening in place, there's still going to be at least 1,000 people, or at least groups, who could still make pandemics and release them. And if we go back to Aum Shinrikyo, the apocalyptic cult in Japan, their biological weapons program was led by a graduate-trained virologist who specialized in what passed for genetic engineering in the 1990s. He was executed for assisting the cult in releasing chemical weapons on innocent people in the subways. They tried to get their hands on Ebola. Today, anyone with that kind of background could definitely make a pandemic virus from scratch. And the cult had the resources to make the DNA, even if they didn't have to do it conventionally. So we're going to have to deal with this problem.
I see myself at both ends of this one. I hate the idea of having false information, and I also believe that it's completely possible to take this information and cause catastrophic damage with it. But I tend to think that we need to take major risks and then be ready to deal with the consequences. And this World Health Organization, this Health Hub initiative, this vaccine factory network that they've got going on, it's not just about vaccine response, it's about genetic surveillance. That's not something I made up, that's their plan. They are already training teams to mass monitor the environment for dangerous genetic signals.
For example, the partnership between South Africa and Nigeria in genomic surveillance has led to the training of students from across the continent, a number of countries.
I know there might be a trade-off for some of these interventions between the right to privacy and safety. How do you think about that trade-off? Can we still have the right to privacy in these worlds?
Yeah, so the sequencing-based monitoring preserves privacy as long as you are mixed together enough samples. And it's actually quite difficult to sort of fish a human genome out of that in particular. And if people want your genome, they can get it anyway. But it's obviously going to be a much larger project. And there's a lot of work to do concerning where should we build it? Where should the nodes be? What do you sample? I mean, obviously it's going to involve untargeted metagenomic sequencing on samples from ideally the air traffic hubs, because presumably those are the places where it's going to be spreading most rapidly. Maybe the planes themselves, plain wastewater, air filters and the like. Maybe even sampling flight crews directly if we can persuade them to give samples. That raises privacy issues in the ways the others don't. Even if you somehow knew what the agent was going to be in advance, even if you identified a pandemic-capable virus in nature, say, and wanted to create a vaccine for it, you can make the vaccine. I mean, if it's an mRNA vaccine, you can make it in a day. But you can't run a phase 2 challenge trial to see if it works. Because to do that, you'd have to infect a bunch of people with a virus of unknown lethality that has never infected a human, and if you didn't do this, might never. So that's the real challenge. You just can't run the phase 2 until the thing's already out there. And if we're willing, we should at a minimum be willing to run combined phase 1 and phase 2 trials immediately. That is, we learn of a novel agent that is spreading. We should have vaccine factories that can immediately churn out a vaccine within a couple of days and launch a combined phase 1 and phase 2 trial using ring vaccination around wherever the areas that the threat appears to be present.
We're living in a new era, the molecular era.
And I would like to thank all of those who have tried to face up to this new problem and overcome these problems. Because we've got really a world before COVID and after COVID, like before Christ and after Christ. It's before COVID and after COVID.